today. We're glad to be presenting this as a part of our centennial year. The library, as you will hear, has been a part of the town of Kent for well over 100 years, but our beloved red brick building opened at the end of March 1922. We've been celebrating for months with programs and parties and giveaways, and we hope that this year is our best ever as we strive to serve all the people of Kent and the surrounding communities. Many of you have a copy of our history book. If for some reason you don't have one and you'd like one, we do have many more at the library. Please stop by and pick one up. It's fabulous. It was put together by the Centennial Committee that also put a really fabulous online timeline that's available on our website. But that has everything. That has Kent history, library history, national history, books of the decades. This is just the library history, but especially in those later pages, you'll see lots of familiar faces, and it's a really lovely piece. So, to our program today, thank you so much to Georgianne Kent, who I think is back in the back, Jane Farnol and the cast, and St. Andrews for hosting. I hope you enjoy the show.
Kent, March 2nd, 1799. In the name of God, Amen. I, Peter Pratt of Kent, in the county of Litchfield in the state of Connecticut, laboring under some indisposition of body, and being of sound mind and memory, dispose of my worldly estate in the following manner. First of all, I resign my soul into the hands of Almighty God, my Creator, and my body to the priest to be buried in decent Christian manner.
When he died the following August, Peter Pratt, one of the original shareholders of the town of Kent, left an estate of $2,484.84 to his well-beloved wife Rebecca, 1/3 of his land, a horse and 2 cows, part of a house to live in, and all the indoor movables. Peter Pratt specified that the books, along with the rest of his estate, were to be left to his son.
By the time his descendant, Orinda Pratt, arrived on the scene some 50 years later, there was somewhat more variety of reading matter. There were, for instance, stories in the magazines that arrived at the Pratt house, and books, like a rather racy novel, and Atwater's Early History of Kent, advanced reading for a girl of 12, but all of which Orinda read and noted in her diaries.
1859, February 3rd. I read Harper's in the morning and sewed in the afternoon. Read Harper's, the Litchfield Enquirer. Read Mr. Atwater. Read a magazine from Drake's or Lady's Book. Read some in Shadyside. It is all really a Shadyside. Finished Shadyside in the evening. Her really shady story.
There was also a move in Kent towards some form of organized book reading. It was a ladies' reading circle held regularly in various homes, at which one member read parts of a book, perhaps while others sewed. In her diary, Orinda recorded the meetings, which she probably attended with her mother when she went.
1859, Wednesday, March 5th. Did not go to reading circle. Mother read about John Adams.
By the 1880s, books were being circulated in Kent by a lending organization called the Franklin Square Library. By joining the Kent Division and paying a fee good for 2 years, members had the free use of more than 300 books. The book list offered novels such as Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, Dickens' Pickwick Papers, and Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. Biographies. One could read a life of James Garfield or the correspondence of Talleyrand and Louis XVIII. History, including 2 books about Russia, and general interest like social etiquette and home culture, and flower and weed. The special agent For the Kent branch was an R.M. Gibbs, possibly Miss Roxanne Mary Gibbs. And if so, the library may have been located in the Gibbs House, now the Robarge House, just south of the Congregational Church. It was only a matter of time before the formation of an association known as the Kent Library. By joining, members became shareholders, although non-shareholders could also borrow by paying $1 every 6 months. The annual tax was to be paid on the first Saturday of January, and the books were probably kept in the rear of a store owned by Charlie Smith in what became Chase in Giddings and is now the Villager Restaurant. Borrowing was serious business, and the rules of the club were pasted into the front of every volume.
Books can be drawn only on the first and third Saturday afternoon of each month. Must be returned 2 weeks after, or can be renewed once only. Fine for not returning within 1 week of the time, 5 cents for each book, and 1 cent per day each day after until return. All damage to books to be appraised by the librarian with the right of appeal of the trustees when over 50 cents. Fine for lending a book, 25 cents.
A list of some of the books that could be borrowed in 1904 includes Churchill's The Crisis, Sarah Orne Jewett's The Tory Lover, Kipling's Kim, and Adams' Democracy and Social Ethics, as well as Torrey's Footing It in Franconia, and Job's Among the Waterfowl by Kent's naturalist congregational minister. For some reason, perhaps because the space was no longer available to them, the stockholders decided to end the association, and the books were dispersed through an auction sale. But the power of the word was not to be denied. The association was reborn in what was called the Kent Book Club, which printed a catalog of 262 books, including 29 biographies, 126 works of fiction, 13 history titles, and 6 books about the outdoors. Its charges were somewhat more palatable for the frequent flyer. 10 cents for a single book, 25 cents to borrow for a quarter of the year, and 75 cents for the whole year. The fines were easier too. A penny a day for the first week, and then 2 cents a day until the book was returned. It's uncertain just where the library was first located, but for some time it was kept by Miss Kate Hobson from the cabinets in the south sitting room of the house that stood where the Kent Hills condominiums do now.
One of its avid readers was a manuscript editor with a fierce love of books and a determination that Kent should have a real library.
Mary Bacon was the daughter of Francis Mills, who had left Kent when she married a George Bacon from New Haven. When her husband died, Frances gathered her young children and returned home to the Kent farm that Mary eventually worked. Beginning about 1912, Mary Bacon began her campaign to stir up interest in a public library. After much perseverance on her part, a meeting was finally held in Center School on January the 18th, 1915, and a committee formed to investigate whether there was felt to be a need for a free public library in Kent. There was. Reporting a month later, the committee, chaired by the Reverend C.H. Perry, was unanimous.
In our judgment, a free public library is needed in our town. We find that quite a number of people feel the need of it and want it. We believe the town ought to provide for a free public library as it does for public schools. But the conditions are such in this town that we recommend a library association be organized and incorporated to establish and maintain a free public library for the people of Kent.
That evening, the Free Public Library Association was formed, with Mary Bacon as its president, a position she would hold for the next 11 years. Her vice president was Frank H. Peete, her secretary, Hugh Mosher, and her treasurer, Mrs. N.M. Watson. By August, the incorporation was complete, and attention could be turned to finding housing for the library and raising money, which was to be accomplished by arranging for a first-class entertainment as soon as possible. The entertainment committee consisted of Miss Bacon, Miss Hobson, Mr. Perry, Mr. Mosher, Mrs. Watson, Miss Cronies, and Mrs. Tuttle. Was to be an extremely active and ingenious one. In 1915 alone, the following events would bring in $439.99.
Stereo optician party, $10.25. Card parties, $16.40. Kent Carnival, $154.64. Second Carnival, $49.75. Picture raffle, $15.50. And the first class entertainment and dance, $144.30. The entertainment, which was so successful, it was repeated in the Gaylordsville Hall, included Mr. Ellis, a professional vaudeville artist, and the musical comedy The Lilies of the Field, which featured members of the association.
Throughout 1916, Mary Bacon and the association worked prodigiously. A state grant of $200 for books was applied for, a building lot was considered, as well as the possibility of renting a storehouse as temporary quarters, and an offer of land was considered and accepted. The lot was on the narrow side, and an adjacent piece of land would have to be purchased to enlarge it, but the price was right. The land was to be transferred to the Library Association from Frederick Johnson for the consideration of
a desire to have all the people of Kent enjoy the benefits derived from the reading of pure literature and for the advancement of the moral and social being of said town.
The offer was gratefully accepted, the legal transfer executed, and then a month later returned with thanks, when the building committee proposed that another piece of property be bought instead for $1,500. This property, centrally located on Main Street next to the railroad, had been the site of an old hotel which had burned. A horse barn on the property housed the town fire department, 500 foot of hose on a carriage, and the owner, C.A. Eaton, specified that the fire department be allowed to stay and remodel the barn. The association agreed, and the lot was purchased. Until there was a library building, however, a room was rented on Lane Street in the home of Mrs. A.L. Tuttle, who was to be paid $100 a year for rent and her services as librarian. Mrs. Tuttle's library room was open only 2 afternoons a week on Wednesdays and Saturdays from 3 until 9 in the evening. Each day, the librarian kept a record of the number and types of books borrowed. On March 10th, 1917, for instance, she counted 25 fiction, 10 juvenile, 3 biographies, 2 nature, 1 sociology, 2 travel, 2 physiology. On July 21st, the entry read, "No books were charged. Terrific thunderstorm."
Library expenses were modest. From June to December of 1916, aside from a payment of $1,000 towards the lot and the $25 quarterly rent to Mrs. Tuttle, there was only a $21.78 entry for a rummage sale and $2.75 spent for the American Library Association book list, and 2 other small payments amounting to $13.05. Meanwhile, a vigorous building subscription campaign was underway, with average pledges ranging from $5 to an incredible $200, including a $100 contribution from Orinda Pratt and her brother Joel. As some members of the association were rather delinquent in paying their dues, a committee was formed in 1918 to increase membership, one of the members being the same Orinda Pratt, now in her 72nd year and something of an eccentric.
Orinda had attended a fashionable finishing school, Miss Ward's in Bridgeport. She had taken the obligatory grand tour of Europe in her youth and went off to New York to theaters and concerts when she was older. She had good taste in clothes and dressed well in company, but frightened a new hired man to death with the outlandish things she wore at home. She knew her social etiquette, but ignored the common courtesies. After church, she would make a point of informing the minister of any grammatical errors he had made.
It's likely that membership had fallen because of the war, but ultimately the war would be the stimulus that would lead to the first spadeful of earth being dug for the library building. Reacting in January of 1919 to a suggestion from the town that a memorial board be erected on the library property, listing the names of the men and women who had gone to the war from Kent, the association concluded,
While we are wholly in sympathy with the movement to erect a memorial, it is also the sense of the association that a memorial board, even as a temporary memorial, is not worthy of the sacrifice made by our soldiers. And moreover, it's unsightly.
For some reason, the board thought a drinking fountain was a better idea. And it was another year before they reached the conclusion that the most appropriate memorial would be the library itself. The names of the soldiers to be inscribed on a memorial tablet inside the building. Yet another year went by while the committee considered the possibility of moving to the site of Mary Hatch's brick barn, now the rear portion of the Fife and Drums gift shop, and discussed at length how the building should be positioned, until in September of 1921 a vote was taken that the library be built at once, facing Main Street. And on October 27th, the cornerstone was cemented into place by the Honorable Everett J. Lake, Governor of Connecticut.
Anne Hobson remembered that Mary Bacon, who had been invited to luncheon before the ceremonies, showed up in her usual disarray. She came dressed, no doubt, wearing her best sturdy shoes and a dress she had dragged out of a trunk, probably dating back to the old days of Paris, wrinkled and impossible. Mrs. Watson took it off of her, pressed it, and Miss Bacon presided over the occasion with the charm of a queen. She had a beautiful smile, and her gentle voice had a quality that no one who heard it will forget.
Governor Lake himself was greeted with a standing ovation and spoke personally of the service of the Kent soldiers in France, concluding,
I know that there were dark days in the Reconstruction period following the Civil War, even as there are dark days now. But those days passed away and the nation became united again. We must now crystallize the ideals for which the World War was fought. Contrary to belief, religion in this country is not slipping, and the same stamina and fighting spirit shown on the battlefield is now being put into education, of which this library is a sample. In these days and in the days to come, let us not forget that American ideals are moral and spiritual and not material. Remember that in honoring the Kent boys who took part in the war, you are honoring American ideals. Let us be true to them.
the metal case that Governor Lake sealed into the cornerstone contained the order of ceremony, a list of the men in service in the Great War, a list of the subscribers, and the names of the executive committee of the Kent Library Association, the selectmen, the town treasurer, the contractors and builders, and the architect. The ceremony was followed by a reception at the firehouse, where refreshments were served in the upper hall. By that date, $3,500 had been collected in subscriptions, and Mary Bacon announced that a gift of $1,000 had been received from Mrs. Granger of Brooklyn, who was a former resident of Kent. Reporting on the ceremony, the New Milford Times added that
a summer visitor remarked that there were more important books in the Kent collection of 1,500 volumes than in some libraries containing 25,000 or more. Being crowded at all times for room, the library committee has been compelled to economize space for excluding books which some might class as trash.
The new library building was to be brick with white trim, with the intention of recreating a typically colonial building. Its architect was Heathcote Woolsey, and after a number of bids were considered, its construction was entrusted to the firm of Taylor and Buckingham of New Milford. The new librarian was perhaps the first actually trained as one. Helen Roberts Bull had taken on the job from Miss Ann Hobson, who had continued to run the library from the room in the Tuttle House. Helen Bull's love for her job is charmingly evident from this excerpt from a speech she gave to a group of students.
You are thrown in with the nicest kind of people who have the same interest that you do. And you have the companionship of the very best that has been written. Now, I don't mean to say you can spend all your time reading, but you do have the opportunity of keeping abreast of the times and choosing for yourself what you will read. You can have the fun of cataloging and using the typewriter. You can mend old books, which in itself is quite an art, and really quite fun. You have numberless questions asked of you. Very interesting, especially if you are the reference librarian. And that's the very best sport of all, to look up the answers. The public that you serve may be rather fussy, so you have to be very diplomatic in all your dealings, or there's likely to be a row. People will swear up and down that a certain book has been returned, or there is no fine due, when every record shows plainly to the contrary. But that makes things rather interesting and amusing. In one of the branches where I worked, we had a drunken man came in for several times, and he always insisted on having the Bible, from which he read loudly for everyone's benefit. Then you frequently have people who suddenly have a fit and fall down on the floor, and you always have one Englishman bawling at the top of his voice. I've had such funny questions asked of me. One night, a young lady who was slugging the port asked me if I could give her Kelly and Sheets poems, or someone wants the Three Musketeers of Dumas, or 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea.
Helen Bull would be the librarian until her death in 1940. One of her greatest interests was the development of the children's department, where she was said to have checked out every child's hand for cleanliness and every shoe for mud. In 1941, as a memorial to her, a small version of a Connecticut tavern table of the 1700s was built for the children's library and inscribed with her name and the dates of her service. It was unveiled by 4 children and was used in the upper room by hundreds of young readers. Now it can be seen in the reading room right below the memorial plaque.
In 1922, Helen Bull had given the Library Association the funds that enabled it to finish construction, holding a mortgage on the building with a Beatrice Goldsmith, also from Brooklyn. A mortgage, incidentally, that was paid off by the following June through a $5,000 bequest from the same Mrs. Granger who had helped to buy the property 2 years before. Still, more money was needed, and the Library Association turned its energies to an event that was to become a huge success and something of a Kent tradition, the street fair. Here's how the New Milford Times reported one of these August celebrations.
Very pretty and in all ways charming was the street fair held in Kent on Thursday, Friday, and Saturday of last week for the benefit of the Kent Memorial Library. And best of all, it was as successful financially as it was in all other ways. The scene was in the upper end of Main Street, a short way south of the Congregational Church, the fine lawn serving as a pretty background for the sale booths which lined both sides of the street. Each booth was a work of art in itself, those in charge having devoted a good deal of attention to making it first of all attractive, and in keeping with the general scheme of the decorations, in harmony with the beautiful colonial library building, the colonial buff was the prevailing color. Even the post which marks the scene of the bazaar, and from which were strung the electric lights, being covered with buff bunting. Particularly worthy of note in connection with the entire affair was the untiring zeal of Miss Mary Bacon, who enthused all who shared in the good work.
There seemed to have been an international theme this year, with Chinese, Spanish, and Dutch booths, and the volunteers all in costume. There was a Chinese tea garden, a learned astrologer, who was the librarian in an appropriate costume, a palm reader, a wheel of fortune, a milk stand, a grab bag, and booths of art, flowers and vegetables, and garden hats. Lawrence Nelson had offered as a gift to paint a portrait, and there was a presentation of vaudeville numbers given in the tent, a Punch and Judy show, folk dancing, exhibitions of jiu-jitsu, wrestling and boxing, and Javanese dance.
In case of rain, all was not lost. In fact, there was a considerable profit. In 1922, the New Milford Security Company issued a policy from Hartford Fire Insurance, guaranteeing $175 for each of the 3 days of the fair that saw 1/10 of an inch of rain. The amount of rainfall was to be determined by a reading taken by Connecticut Light and Power at Bull's Bridge. By 1924, the rain insurance had increased to $2,000, written by the Eagle, Star, and British Dominions Insurance Company Limited of London, England.
The profits of that street fair were shared by the Community House Association and the fire department. And the building was far enough along that Mary Bacon was planning the dedication ceremonies to be held on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1925. The cornerstone of this dedication was to be the unveiling of a bronze tablet by Willard D. Patton, inscribed with the names of the 66 men and women who had enlisted from Kent in the war. There were Thompsons and Halls, Kissons and Hobsons, Souls and Tobins, and Miss Bacon invited all those she could find. 3 had died. It was a warm day for November and very sunny. And at 1 o'clock, a turkey dinner, complete with sweet potatoes, apple pie, ice cream, coffee, and cigars, was held in the town hall, served by waitresses dressed in red, white, and blue, and paid for by the town. Grace was said by Father Sill of Kent School, who acted, the papers reported, in his usual happy manner. He was followed by the commander of the New Milford Post of the American Legion, who invited the Kent veterans to join his unit and offered his help if they wanted to form their own. Miss Helen Hobson, who had served as a wireless operator with the army in France, quickly and characteristically spoke up for the latter.
It was after 2 when the invited guests made their way to the library through a large crowd that had gathered, as the stores and schools had all been closed for the occasion. Inside the building, the ceremonies began with the singing of America by the joint choirs of the churches and Kent School. After the invocation and a hymn, Miss Bacon introduced Colonel Arthur P.S. Hyde, rector of a church in Peekskill, in full uniform with a profusion of medals, who spoke about his service in France and how President Wilson's proclamation of fasting and prayer for Memorial Day of 1918 had turned the tide for the soldiers. A silk flag covered the bronze plaque above the fireplace. Miss Bacon pulled a cord to release it, and the flag slipped onto the mantel shelf, revealing the inscription, "This library, built by the townspeople, commemorates the honorable service of these men and women in the armed forces of our country in the World War." Before the benediction, Father Sill gave a short history of the library and paid tribute to Mary Bacon, who had been its first and only president. And then the choruses sang the Battle Hymn of the Republic, and the dedication ceremonies were ended.
As impressive and heartfelt as they must have been, they were not as grand as Mary Bacon had conceived them. In July, she had written to John Pershing, General of the Armies, who found an invitation on his return from Europe and replied,
It has always given me a great deal of pleasure when I have found it possible to take part in such exercises as this, and I wish that it were possible for me to give you a favorable reply. My plans, however, from now until several months after my retirement from active service on September 13th, are such that it would not be practicable for me to name a date when I could attend your interesting exercises.
where the library was concerned, Mary Bacon was nothing if not fearless. She had no doubt invited General Pershing after receiving this letter in May from the White House.
My dear Miss Bacon, I deeply appreciate your kind invitation to be present at the dedication of the memorial to the men of Kent who took part in the World War. I wish that I could be with you, not only because I know and have a great affection for the small towns of New England, but because I am particularly attracted by the form which this memorial takes. Through education, we can best maintain what they fought to preserve, and the library will be a fitting and lasting monument to their sacrifice. Very truly yours, Calvin Coolidge.
The library had come a long way since the days of the reading circle and the book club. In 1958, an addition would be added that would triple its working space, named for the architect of the original building, Heathcote Woolsey, who would die the year before. 35 years later, the sheer volume of its books would strain even this building at its seams, and the library would need to expand again. Well into the 21st century, it will have seen 12 more librarians and 29 more association presidents. As for Mary Bacon, after working so hard to bring the idea of a free public library in Kent to reality, she resigned as president in 1926, having seen her precious books finally shelved in a handsome and permanent building. One wonders with what emotions she wrote this letter to the association she had created, and marvels, too, at what a legacy and responsibility she had left to the town of Kent.
Friends, it is with keen sorrow that I ask you to relieve me of my responsibility as president of the Kent Library Association. As soon as my successor can be elected, I shall step down. I love the library and always shall. Every book, every brick, and above all, love and deeply appreciate the loyal support that I have unfailingly received from all of you throughout these long years. But I do feel just now my farm needs all the strength I have to put into it. I sincerely believe that a change of president would benefit the library. I have tried to do my share, and it is up to you to carry on. Sincerely yours, Mary Bacon.